Welcome back. Our second panel, Collecting Chinese Art Overseas, examines the mechanisms and motivations for collecting Chinese art in overseas Chinese networks in the turbulence of the late 19th and 20th centuries. Two of the speakers in this panel, Dr. Meijin, Director of the Huakang Museum of the Chinese Culture University in Taipei, and Mr. Sunny Tang, Curator at the Hong Kong Museum of Art, send their apologies for not being able to attend the conference in person today. However, they will be delivering their papers via Skype. There will be no panel discussion, but there will be a 5 to 10 minutes Q&A after each speaker. Our first speaker for this panel is Ms. Jennifer Lam Cayenne, who is here with us. Jennifer is currently a curator at the National Gallery, Singapore. She read art history at the University of Hong Kong and also holds an MA in curating contemporary art from Royal College of Art, London, where she co-curated Whose Game Is It? And Of Our Own Making, among other curatorial projects. While at the National Gallery, Singapore, Jennifer actively contributes to the continuous research and curation on art in Singapore and the ink medium. She was involved in exhibitions and projects including Wu Guangzhong Expressions of Pen and Palette in 2018, Recollect the Making of Our Art collection in 2018, and Rediscovering Treasures, Ink Art from the Xiuhailou collection in 2017. Her paper today is titled An Ecosystem of Collecting in Singapore, Rediscovering Treasures in the Xiuhailou collection. Ms. Lam, please.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today, and especially thank you, ACM, for this opportunity to share this research. 3 years ago, in March 2017, National Gallery Singapore collaborated with the Yo family to present the exhibition Rediscovering Treasures, Ink Art from the Xiuhailou collection. Established by Yokilim, Xiuhailou has remained in the family for over 2 generations. It has been acclaimed as one of the 4 most important collections alongside Huang Manshi's Bai Shanzai, Lo Choktiu's Xu Baizai, and of course, Tan Zhichuo's香雪庄. Rediscovering Treasures as an exhibition was the first survey by a national museum on this local collection. So let us take a quick look through the exhibition and a glimpse of the treasures within. The Xiuhailou collection offers a glimpse into the evolution of modern Chinese painting and traces the movements and trends that shaped its transformation from tradition to modernity. As such, the exhibition is made up of 6 different sections, as we see here. The name Xiuhailou of this collection was derived from a stanza of a Song Dynasty poet, Su Shi. As I hold these pebbles and go back, I carry the eastern sea in my sleeves. 我持此时归，袖中有东海. It is a metaphor to the variety of styles and genres in the collection and also alludes to its humble beginning. Here, what we see is the first section of the exhibition, the introductory room, where we have staged an atmospheric presentation of Yokilim's study room. So Yokilim is a pioneering local Teochew businessman, but unlike his peers, such as Lo Choktiu and Tan Zhichuo, he was very much a self-made man. He came from middle class or not too well-off family, and starting a business himself, and because of a strike of luck and also wit, he was able to amass a healthy fortune in that sense. And as for his curiosity as well as interest in collecting, it first started in the 50s when he was trying to pursue a Japanese client. After many, all these stories are from the Yo family. So after many pursuits of this Japanese client, he was still unable to strike a deal, and as such, he was feeling quite frustrated. But on the last day, the Japanese client came to his office, or went to his office, and saw noticed a Chibashi painting hanging there. He really was attracted by it, and without thinking much, Yokilim took it off the wall and gifted it to this client. He, of course, was very elated, and therefore subsequently struck a big business deal with him. And from this little gesture, it shows that, it sparked off Yokilim's curiosity as to what made this painting so unique and so interesting that it actually helped me to create a big business deal. Because for him at that time, having a shop house by the Singapore River, often he will just get dealers or a man just pulling carts, asking whether people will want to buy like boxes of scrolls or just random artifacts and whatnot. So that's how he kind of first started amassing this collection. So back to this room, that is the actual desk that Yokilim has used every day. What we learned from his family is that he would practice calligraphy every morning and evening. On the other side of this table, we have an infographic which showcases the ecosystem behind the Shohaolo collection, which we'll go into details later. So now, the first section of the artworks in the Shohaolo exhibition. To create a more logical display, we went with a loose chronological approach in the artwork display. If we are to go with Yo's collecting timeline, then the artworks in this section from the Ming and Qing period, which were acquired towards the later part of Yokilim's life, would have appeared later. These artworks here from the Ming and Qing dynasty reveal that his understanding of Chinese art deepened as he acquired a more sophisticated taste for works that reflected a scholarly temperament and elegance. The second section is a focus on the Shanghai school. Yokilim had a special affinity for the Shanghai school and collected many fine works by Shanghai school masters, such as this 6th panel that we see here by Ren Xun. The title of this work is The Scent of Flowers and Singing of Birds, Huakang Niao Yu. Defined by a blend of ancient and modern, the Shanghai school encompassed both the innovative revival of tradition and the new aesthetic taste shaped by modern urban culture. It had a far-reaching impact on the history of modern Chinese art, and many of our Singaporean early artists studied in Shanghai, and the mainstream of painting here actually was also largely influenced by the Shanghai school, the Taipei. Next is just two smaller sections. Even though many of our Singapore early immigrants came from the Guangdong area where the Lingnan School was founded, most of our pioneers in the first generation, like Chen Wenxi and Chen Chongsui, they actually learned the Shanghai School and recognized themselves with it. And as such, we created this two small enclave to kind of create somewhat of a dialogue, to also provoke us to kind of think, geographically, they may be very close by to each other, but yet stylistically, what was their reason behind? The next section, it's quite a large section, the collection of 20th century Chinese painting. And over here, we see a masterpiece by Xu Beihong that he did during his creative peak when he was living in Singapore or Nanyang. This is the Liu Cao Shi Yi Tu, after a poem of the 6 dynasties. Yokilim especially loved and collected Xu Beihong's paintings. Other works that are also on display or were on display were Xu Beihong's calligraphy, which really showed that Xu Beihong had a very strong training in his Chinese ink background, opposed to common belief that he was solely just embracing the Western sphere. So now, let's go back to the infographics of the Shohailo collection and its ecosystem. This summary, it all began with To Lam Huat's book, Ge An Kan Shan, which was published in 2010. In the book, To collated his interviews with several local and overseas collectors of Chinese art. Using that as a basis, I then expanded this research, including materials from my seniors, found literatures, as well as newspaper clippings and primary archives. Can you see well? So, oops. So here you see Yokilim here, and next to him will be Chor and Lo Choktiu. At the same time, around that period, Huang Manshi, Venerable Kong Hiao, Tan Keng Chou, who are the Chinese-speaking collectors of Chinese art at that period. And what To had actually not included in his book, which we then included here, are the English-speaking community of collectors of Chinese art. And in that sense, this Chinese art could be Chinese ink paintings, but also Chinese art in terms of more modernist and abstract creations by the Singapore Art Society, the Modern Art Society, etc. So there we have Frank Sullivan, Lok Wan To, and of course Kwan and Michael Sullivan. So looking at this diagram, using materials that have been listed, we created specific characters to classify the different groups. So let me go back. So they are here, the characters, which we try to map it to each name. So these characters are artists, collectors, connoisseurs, organizations, loosely, like whether it could be non-profit, schools, or government bodies, as well as businesses, as in corporations. So let's look a little bit deeper with a larger image. The 4 stages of collecting, or factors that influence the formation of a collection, was identified after collating all these various data together. So first we have, of course, the source of collection, where the collector purchased his work. And for Yokilim's case, they came from largely the open market, but of course also from previous collectors, such as Kui Bak Song and the Chi Quan Tang, when their collection actually dissolved into the open market. At the same time, of course, there are dealers such as Zhonghua Shuju, the Zhonghua Book Company, as well as the Shanghai dealer Duo Yun Xuan. Oh, I missed out an N. After the source of collection, the next circle that had a lot of importance or influence on Yokilim's or a collector's way of collecting is his immediate circle. Who was this collector speaking with? Who were his friends? Who was influencing him? And with this, for Yokilim, obviously we see very familiar names, such as Tan Zhichuo, Pan Shou, Chen Wenxi, Chen Zongsui, Lo Choktiu, and Liu Kang. Thirdly, as the collection grows and amasses, slowly a collection identity is bound to be formed. And this collection development, or rather the movement of the items in this collection, is aided by people such as connoisseurs. After the collector himself, like Yokilim himself, doing research into the artworks and the artists. And so here we have world-famous connoisseurs such as Xu Bangda, his disciple Xiaoping, and as well as Yang Renkai. And these three circles actually shows the dynamics of how Yo, or a collector of his time, maybe even our time, had created his or her collection. There's a lot of overlaps here. For example, like Chen Chong-sui, he acted as an artist who Yokilim supported, someone, a consultant that Yokilim consulted with, but at the same time also someone who helped him acquire works into the collection. So there's multiple roles. At the same time as Lo Chuk-tieu as well. Toll noted in his book that the two of them used to have shop houses together, quite in close proximity along the Singapore River. So possibly it was since as early as that time that they began to become acquainted. This was before Lo Chuk-tieu moved to Hong Kong. And as we know, Lo Chuk-tieu is very much known for his Ming Dynasty collection. And I guess in that sense, with these two friends speaking to each other, maybe it could have influenced the way that he had collected. So now, the next section, we're actually going to look at the archival, or rather the primary materials that actually helped us to create this map. And I must credit and thank the Yo family for their generosity and also for their open-heartedness to share these personal records to us, therefore to make this research possible. This photo was taken in 1955 at Yokilim's neighbor's house, which is this man here, Mr. So, Su Biyao, a fellow Teochew entrepreneur and philanthropist. And they happen to be neighbors of David Marshall. And this was taken in 1955, around the period that David Marshall was about to negotiate the independence of Malaya from the British colonial rule. And this is one of the earliest records that show Yokilim's place and also perhaps his status and his part of the pioneering generation of Singapore. Next, we move on to two photographs from the 60s. The left here is a photograph of Yokilim with members of the Singapore-China Society at his Changi Beach family mansion. So we can identify Chen Chong-sui here next to him. Oh, and by the way, I mean, along the way, if any of you might be able to recognize anyone that is not mentioned, please let me know after this panel. Because it took a lot of our detective time to face recognition and map out who is who. And on the left, on the right, is a photo of Yokilim with Lo Chuk-tieu, and again Mr. So, Su Biyao, taken together at this place, which we are speculating is likely to be a temple or a monastery somewhere in either Hong Kong or Taiwan, as you can see the winter clothings. Yeah. So these photos actually offers a glimpse of the close friendships and the close knittedness of the Teochew community in Singapore, because by the 1960s, Lo Chuk-tieu would already have moved his base to Hong Kong. But nonetheless, he remained very much present, as we will see in the later upcoming photographs. Two photos also taken in the 60s, one taken from 2006 ACM's book, a dinner hosted by Tan Tsze, and next to him is Lo Chuk Teo and Yokilim here. And alongside them are artists who we are very much familiar with, such as Chen Renhao here, first from the left, Liu Kang, Chen Wenxi, Zheng Zongsui, and then also Tang Keng Chou and MC Wong. The photograph on the right is a dinner party that Yokilim attended with his friends and business partner at the Pia Zhoulo. I'm not sure what the English translation this is. These photos depicts Yokilim's position within the Singapore society, again, that is within the Chinese circle of artists and collectors, but also at the same time other communities. Moving on to the 1970s now. On the left here, we have a dinner and art appreciation session that Yo hosted at his new home at the Emerald Hills. So guests included Dr. Lu, here, Zheng Zongsui, Chen Wenxi, and also Mr. and Mrs. Shi, who are the people behind the Zhonghua bookstore over here. And on the right, it's a rare photograph taken in Yo's office in Singapore, where Chen Zongsui is studying a painting by Ming Dynasty painter Wang Zhengchuan, and they are both looking at the painting titled Sheshan Bailu Quan Tu, the Bailu Spring in She Mountain. Oh, and there's a bit humorous anecdote behind this, which the Yo family shared with us, which is at that time, having had to move out of the Changi Beach family mansion to make way for our Changi airport, Yo had to move a lot of his artworks back home, but also back into his office. So he hung a lot of artworks in his office to the point that some of their newer clients came in and thought that they had entered an art gallery instead. Okay, I'm going to speed up. Sorry about that. So in 1979, after the China's open door policy, a lot more artists from China were able to come out, or rather travel overseas, and they made visits to Singapore. And somehow all of them inevitably will make a stop at Shohailo and to visit Mr. Yokilim and to see the collection. Why? Well, this is because they want to revisit the works that Yokilim had collected over time. So we see Liu Haisu over here, Zhu Qizhan, but at the same time we have people like Wu Zaiyan, and of course Liu Kang, Shi Hyangtou, and Tang Yun, another collector. So for example, we have an image here of Tang Yun himself validating his own works at the Shohailo. And of course, next is Xie Zhiliu. These photographs create a summary and allowed us to see that how the artists that we now identify as 20th century modern masters were the artists that Yokilim himself had collected. In another word, he was collecting his contemporaries, works by his contemporaries, works like before they were known, and as such, because of their visit and their dialogue, Yokilim was able then to further sharpen up his collection, knowing, for example, which of Xie Zhiliu work are perhaps the poorer one, and then let go, and which of the ones are the stronger one, and he must keep, for example. So one last very important picture here is taken 24th April 1993. It's the last photo of Lo Chuk Teo, because after this lunch in Singapore, he sadly passed away from a heart attack. Yeah. So seeing Lo Chuk-tio ever present in Yokilim's private photo albums over these 3, 4, even 5 decades, it really shows how these friendships testifies time. Okay. Oh, Xu Bangda here with and Yang Renkai. Yeah, and last of all, of course, with every collection, there needs to be an outcome. So what happens to a collection? No answer. Some get donated to public institutions. But most of them actually ended up in the open market and get dispersed. But for Yokilim's case, his one is one of the last one that still very much remain intact and within passing on to the next generation in the Yo family. So we know that he made anonymous donation to a university museum here. We're not sure whether it's NUS or Nanda. We still need to look into that. And of course, in 1974, Chen Song-sui helped him to publish his first catalog of the collection. And subsequently, of course, we at National Gallery Singapore also did the first exhibition and concise publication on the work as well. But I guess the last most important aspect of the outcome is actually how the collector decided to share his collection with the public. And that was done through visits, allowing local and overseas study trips to visit his collection. And this, for Yokilim, started as early as the 1960s. Here we have a photo of taken in 1st October 1965 with members of the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts Chinese Painting Society, accompanied by their teachers, Si Hang-to and Chen Song-sui. And then, of course, 70s. This is the inaugural of the Society of Chinese Artists. And we see many, many, many familiar faces like Huakang, Georgette, Chen Song-sui again. There are even younger ones, such as, where is it? Lim Yo-kwan here, Ho Ho-ying, and a few more, which I can't tell right now, it's a bit fuzzy. And I guess these are the overseas trip that came in 1997. But I guess the last trip that happened the same year that Mr. Yo passed away was this. The National Heritage Board of Singapore, alongside with then director of ACM, Mr. Kenson Kwok, as well as guests from a French bank in Singapore, they all went down to Yokilim's Admiral Hill home to look at his art. Yes, and I am going to conclude here now, whereby the Shohailo's importance and the treasures within this collection really extends beyond what they collect. The collection allows us to deepen our understanding of how art was collected in Singapore from the late 19th century to the early 20th century, as well as the social cultural context that revolves around it. I guess I will end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Lam. Please remain on stage for the Q&A. We'll open the floor for questions. Due to time constraint, we only have time for one question.
If you don't have questions, I can just continue 2 more slides.
No questions?
Oh, yeah, yes?
Materials. According to the photograph, we can't see any picture, photograph of Chor and Yokilim. Is there any connection with both of them?
Chor and Yokilim.
Yokilim, yeah.
That is one that's taken in the 60s. Yeah. Oh. This one here, where the 3 of them are actually seated together. Chor was the one who hosted the dinner. From what we found out, or at least from what we know until up to this point, even though the three of them are all Teochews and within very much embedded in the Teochew communities in Singapore, Yokilim was very much closer to Lo Chok Teo as compared to Tanzi Chor. Not that we know of. Yeah. But I'm sure conversations would come up, as they sit together at dinner. Yeah. No found records at this point. Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Lam. Our next speaker is Dr. Meijin Liu.
There's one more question. Yeah.
Just wondering, was there a sort of gathering associations of collectors like the Minchio Society in Hong Kong?
That I've been thinking about that as well. We're not able to find it, but following on that question, I'll just show you the very last slide that I had wanted to show, which is alongside the time that Yokilim, Lo Chok Teo, and Tanzi Chor were actively collecting, these are the other collectors that were actively collecting as well. And surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, they all fall under within the time period of the 1950s to 1965. Maybe this kind of echoes what Mr. Yo had mentioned this morning about the nation building and the time. But really, the academic research on the culture of collecting and also the history of collecting in Singapore is still very much in its infancy. So I hope maybe next time there will be more to share with everyone.
Thank you, Ms. Lam. Our next speaker is Dr. Meijin Liu, Director of the Huakang Museum in Taipei, who will be delivering her paper virtually. Liu Meijin received her MA in Japanese Language and Culture in 1986 from Suzhou University. The Chinese versions of her two books about Japanese Confucian philosophers, 世界哲学思想丛书, World's Philosophers on Their Thoughts series, edited by Professor Charles. After graduation, she worked at the National Palace Museum and published arts-related articles in 思想杂志, 思源 magazine. She joined Chinese Culture University's Huakang Museum in 2014. Her areas of expertise are Japanese thought, art theory, and Chinese and Western art appreciation. Her paper today is titled, On the Significance and Importance of the Works of Overseas Chinese Artists in the Collection of Huakang Museum. Dr. Liu, please. 刘馆长，听得到吗？
好，大家好，在这边先给大家拜个晚年，祝福大家元宵节健康快乐，研讨会议圆圆满满。那我现在就开始报告我这次的研讨会主题。那我的题目是从馆藏海外华人艺术家的作品论其意义与重要性。那这次报告的题目主旨主要分3个层面。第一个就是中国文化大学博物馆的收藏历史。第二是海外华人私人收藏家的关系。第三是对于中国画的国际发展。那第一项的部分可以看出说我们收藏的历史是相当的丰富。那而我这次跟收藏家和我们博物馆之间呢，我就会以陈之初博士的捐赠为主。那至于第3项关于中国画的国际发展，我就会以郎静山和当大千为例子来看海外华人艺术的现代化，异中求同的统一与创新。那在这个探讨的主题范围呢，主要是分3个方面。第一是在时代背景，现代是处于一个交错的时空，就是古今东西，那也面临了文化的差异，不管是海洋文化或是陆地文化。那因此对象是设定在海外华人的收藏家、艺术家和博物馆这3方面。 要探讨的主要内容就是以中国化的文化使命，如何在这样子的一个交错时空和文化差异之下，能够发展出现代的艺术作品。那再者呢，就是关于海外华人收藏家、艺术家和博物馆三者之间，那我把他们的架构主要集中在以文物作为它的一个中心。那因为以文物作为中心呢，就可以看出说时空的交错和文化差异，以及传统和现代，它们是一个很复杂的一个关系。但是在这复杂当中，文物就具备了发展共同的文化使命。那如何能够在东西方的交流以及传统现代的融合中，创造出统一与创新的艺术文化？那至于中国的一个文化呢，其实它与海洋文化的时代背景，那在历史上有不同的一个诠释。特别是西方的哲人黑格尔曾形容中国文化是背对海洋的文化，而现代的中国也面临了西方来自海洋文化的冲击。那也将近了1个世纪的战争，还有民族迁徙所导致引发现代世界全球化的发展趋势。而海外华人的艺术家在这样子的一个世界舞台上，可以说是对中国文化艺术现代化有着至关重要的影响。那这边我会播放3张我们馆藏的手绘地图。那从描绘的唐玄奘西域取经图，大概就可以知道，在整个中国的地理位置，其实它是大陆和海洋两者兼具的。那另外一点是，除了是玄奘的西域取经之外，但是实际上在考古也出土，在唐代就有海上丝路，一直影响到宋代。那甚至于到了明代，那郑和航海，那从1405到1433年之间，那中国航海的技术可以说是比西方发现非洲好望角要早了将近80年左右。那另外第3张我们馆藏的手绘地图是现代将近这1世纪以来大陆移民台湾地图。但是实际上除了移民台湾之外，它从福建还有广州沿海迁移到南洋的，可以说是也是相当的多，所以就形成了海外华人的一个世界。那接下来呢，我想要进入到也就是说西方的世界观和中国的家天下。因为从上面我们可以看到，中国的海洋活动其实从唐宋的海上丝路到郑和的下西洋，以及明清以来移民的海外华人。那因此面对黑格尔他所说对中国而言，海只是陆地的中段，陆地的天线，他们和海不发生积极的关系。同时他也说，他们的航海不管这种航海发展到怎样的程度都没有影响他们的文化。那事实上我们可以知道说在中国的航海技术在15世纪是领先西方的。那但是为什么没有发展出西方的海洋文化？因为海洋文化的特色是商业贸易，是殖民文化，那可以说是源自于希腊以来的一个文化传统。那可是中国呢，因为它是一个家天下的观念，是以血缘关系为主，相对而言它是比较封闭保守。所以即使是中国的科技在15世纪是领先西方，但是中国的发明罗盘，可是中国人却禁海。尤其到乾隆皇帝的时候，他还禁止建造大船。那发明了火药， 可是只放烟火，发明了印刷术，却限制思想的自由。那这个是在培根的新工具里边，他也提到的一个现象。所以我认为是，整个东西方，特别是中国，因为是一个家天下，似乎就是黑格所说的，它可以向外，但是它基本上因为受限于家天下的血缘观念、保守封建，所以它基本上是背对海洋的。那可是到了现代，接受了西方文化的冲击，所以面临了中国文化的现代化。那首先我想举一个陈之初博士所捐赠给我们博物馆的国父写给海滨同志的博爱。那博爱这2个字呢，可以说是国父他最喜欢提的，天下为公之外就是博爱。那这个博爱呢，可以说是它有2个文化的来源。那第一个就是中国传统儒家民胞物与的仁爱精神，第二个就是西方宗教神爱世人的一个宗教情怀。那因为我们知道国父也曾受洗为基督徒，可是这2者的差别是，西方的宗教强调的是牺牲，那中国儒家强调的是忠君。所以传统中国的知识分子比较缺少革命的精神。那中国的改朝换代主要都是以农民革命为主，而国父呢，则是受到美国华盛顿独立战争的一个影响，所以最后也就走向了革命，创建了中华民国。所以国父的博爱，在1921年，俄罗斯党人马林在云南见国父的时候问说，为什么要革命？国父就回答说，因为爱。所以这一点可以说是从国父的博爱，他就已经兼具了东西方的一个不同文化的精神，找到了一个共通点，然后发展出的一个现代的创新。那而我们也可以从国父的海外历程可以看出说，可以说是行遍世界。那国父也特别强调华侨为革命之母，那因此革命的成功可以说是主要也是得力于海外华人。所以海外华人可以说是最先走在现代化的先驱。那英国的史学家苏利文在中国现代美术革命一文中就提到，在中国社会走向现代化的同时，怎么能拒绝文化艺术的现代化呢？博物馆透过主题我们华冈博物馆那透过早年的时候就曾透过主题性的展览，与海外华人艺术家创作的时代背景，那可以看出海外华人艺术家是如何自省传统文化，以及如何在文化融合中统一与创新。那因为海外华人艺术家居住海外，所以基本上是必须以异中求同为基础，才能创造出新的文化思维与新的艺术风格，形成现代中国文艺复兴的新局面，为中华文化艺术找到世界共通性的世界语言，也因此能让中华文化登上世界的舞台。而海外华人与现代中国文艺复兴的关系呢，我们可以说是1949年国民政府迁台后我们文化大学的张创办人齐云博士就为复兴中华民族文化、发扬现代中国文艺复兴而设立了大学博物馆。那本馆的馆藏书画呢，多来自海外华人收藏家、艺术家捐赠的作品，大笔的捐赠和托管的书画，比方说有俄罗斯画家的油画21幅，还有粉彩画。那这一批呢，在去年底，那由中国文物保护基金会就提出了一个案子，要跟我们进行这个合作的一个连载。那当然我们还有郎静山以及各个 各个艺术家的一个捐款作品。那我们早年也曾举办以海洋地理位置为主的华人历史文化艺术展览，比方说国父与台湾、海南文物特展、金门文物展、华侨文物展，以及陆海三家为主的当代名家书画展等等。那至于文艺复兴是我们创办人张其云博士所提出来的一个观念。那在他的创刊号里边，他特别提到说两颗相接乃成议会，同时也说从中国历史来看，每一个新阶段实际上都是由于文艺复兴而促成了新机运的来临。所以他在他的孔学经义的著作序文当中特别提到，今日的时代可称之为文艺复兴的大时代。那虽然我们都知道西方文艺复兴的志意是古典的再生，实际上文艺复兴的意义则是现代对古典的重新诠释与创造。比方说我们唐代因为佛教的传入而有了禅宗，同时也开启了宋明理学。那明代呢，西洋传教士来华传入了西方最新的科技发展，只可惜当时中国思想比较封闭，所以未能获得兴盛。而现代呢，则是更全面、更广泛的一个东西方文化传统现代交流融汇的一个时代。所以我们中国文化大学华冈博物馆，那在图片上可以看到左右的对联，其实是大千先生为我们创办人80大寿所书写的春晓华冈历，高峰太代尊。那这一张我们文化大学的校景呢，是宫殿式的建筑，可以看出我们文化大学的地理位置还有是在阳明山，所以它是一个结合自然资源与人文环境的一个场所。那这是我们周边的商贸山。那我们文化大学也称作华冈，意思是美在中华，凤鸣高冈。那它的人文环境呢，就像刚刚看到的是宫殿式的建筑。那在这个简图的右下角有一个华表，那实际上这个华表呢，是除了故宫博物院有之外，就是我们文化大学有。那如果是在两岸的大学当中，除了我们有华表之外，还有的就是北京大学也有华表。那同时我们的校的建筑都是以中国文化精神为名，比方说有大城馆、大人馆。那同时我们校园内的道路，从中央大道到孔子大道，其实都是以圣人之名为名的。那因此在这边我们简单介绍一下我们中国文化大学华冈博物馆的一个基本精神。第一个呢，它代表的是说大学是一个文化的象征，其实也是文明进步的泉源。那至于大学的博物馆呢，以博物馆而言，它的主要精神则是以人为本，以物为重。那我们创办人特别希望这两者的结合呢，希望现代的大学能够博物馆化。那同时在106年5月18号国际大学博物馆日，那特别有新华试点介绍我们博物馆。那其中呢，主持人还在最后做了一个结语，说一所伟大的大学要有一所伟大的博物馆。而我们博物馆的收藏当中呢，其中有很多重要的也是来自陈之初博士的一个捐赠其中我放的这3张呢，就有康有为的，那还有是2张，对不起，还有就是郑弘年先生的。那我们可以看到郑弘年先生呢，他作为一个华侨教育界也是最具有代表和影响力的。 那他晚年的著作呢，也有新加坡暨南校友会刊行。那另外还有大千先生的，还有于右任右老先生的，还有吴昌硕先生的，那以及蔡元培先生，还有樊真祥，柳雅子，那这也都是陈之初博士捐赠的。那这2张画呢，一个是岭南画派陈少昂先生所画的老虎，那在里边的题跋还有郁达夫先生，还有叶公绰先生的。那在左边的话，那大家都知道，那也是属于任伯年的人物山水画。那除了陈之初先生捐赠的书画作品之外，那我们还有一个香雪庄长印的印谱，那在它的内页就有陈之初先生他特别题写的华冈博物馆绘存，那对我们而言也是非常重要的一个纪念藏品。那在它里边呢，还有陈之初先生用硬笔所画的齐白石先生像等等。好，那因为时间关系，我就很快的跳到我们馆藏也就是我这次报告的第3个主题，也就是华人艺术家如何在异中求同当中呢，创造出统一与创新的艺术作品。那以郎静山的集锦摄影与张大千的泼墨绘画为例，那大家看到的这张海报呢，就是我们博物馆上一档展览所办的郎静山与张大千艺术展。那这一张摄影作品是郎静山的集锦摄影，那它这个张作品呢，其实是由至少是4张底片合成的，就有点类似像我们现代的Photoshop。好，告诉我时间只剩1分钟是吗？好，那这2位大师呢，都可以说是为中国现代艺术创造了世界性的语言。郎静山的集锦摄影，它可以说是集合了摄影和绘画2者的融合，而且是用中国传统6法的传音摹写来沟通的。那至于大千先生呢，他则是运用泼彩创造出最接近西方抽象的表现形式。那所以我会认为说郎静山的集锦摄影呢，其实就是一种摄影中国画，那就相较于吴冠中的油画中国画是同样的一个道理。那右上方是溥心畬先生为郎老70祝寿的，那左下方是大千先生为郎老80祝寿的。那这张是我们馆藏的群山耸翠，也是郎老代表的集锦作品。那左下方还有大千先生的题记内容。那我想时间具体内容我就不太详细，我赶快跳到下一章。那集锦摄影其实它的一个方式，为什么说是有点类似像 Photoshop 呢？比方说它就是由下方2张的作品各取其一部分，然后再重新放映在一张底片上，或者是这张作品也是非常有特色的。好，那这也是好。那郎老很快介绍完，我就进入到大千。那大千它左下方的扇面画的是一个牡丹花，但是这牡丹花也叫佛头青。而右边的佛像的临摹呢，它的发色也是佛头青。所以佛头青呢有3个意思，第一个是指颜料石青，第二个是敦煌壁画佛头的发的颜色，第3个就是宋徽宗皇帝的时候呢，用佛头青的颜料来画牡丹，所以牡丹呢也可以叫做是佛头青。那甚至于还会用来画荷花，所以这也就表示了说大千先生他的艺术作品为什么能够 是传统和现代的结合，主要是说他把握到敦煌壁画的庄严璀璨的佛陀经表现，然后再者用中国泼墨的技法把它转向成泼彩。所以西方的绘画呢，它是重色彩的，特别是非常璀璨强烈的色彩。那同时在它游欧之后，了解西方现代的自由抽象的表现，所以他又把泼墨转向了泼彩，所以他很能够把中国的传统跟西方现代的精神做了一个结合，创造出他自己的独特的风格。那我这左右两边的两幅图左边的就是1955年南张北浦两位合作的一个作品，也是我们馆藏的12山水册页之一。那右边的呢是大千1956年在法国见到与毕卡索碰面，当时毕卡索送给他的一个试着用中国的笔墨来表现的一个作品。那实际上大千和毕卡索的关系，大千曾经有评述毕卡索他有2点，第一点是玩世不恭，第二个是神经不正常。那当然这一点呢也是一种他个人的一个表现我这边就先不多做叙述了。那而至于他最具有现代化的一个泼彩的作品，我这边举2个例子。那这个例子可以看出说它的青绿大表现之外，还有一个特点就是以白为雪的一个实际的一个表现，因为就不同于我们传统是以留白的方式来代表空间或者是说雪景。那另外一个就是它的山雨欲来的局部，那我特别会放这个局部中心，就是说它表现出既以白为光，因为在西方的绘画里边是非常强调光的表现，除了色彩以外，而中国的绘画以往传统的文人水墨画是不太重视色彩、彩色，也不太重视光线的。可是大千这个作品里边呢，就特别强调出来。所以这边呢有一段我们听听看大千讲述老子的。他说老子的学说所讲的就是我们抽象化的道理。
老子的学说他所讲都是抽象化的道理。
以貌取色，普通面貌不要，这是抽象。
普通面貌不要，
无相之相，
这是抽象。他又说无相之相，没有相当中有相，所以不必一定要有相这个东西，但是有它的精神在，所以这个也是抽象。他还有2句话说的最明白，他说得其环中超以相外。我们现在这个圈圈里头做功夫最后跳出圈子就好了嘛。
好，那我们从大千的一个上述可以知道说，它的抽象其实是跟中国的文人水墨画不直不行的观念是相通的。那因此我的结语就以现代中国文艺复兴是受西方文化影响开启了现代化的开端，应该是回归传统的同时也是面向西方的。而这段话其实我是套用苏立文先生他在东西方美术交流的序文中所说。他说今天有越来越多的研究者接受了东西方文化相互影响是自欧洲文艺复兴以来世界历史上最有意义事件的观念。从16世纪开始，西方的思想艺术文化便迈出了走向东方的步伐。所以西方迈向了东方，中国的现代化也势必会迈向西方。这是我以上的报告，谢谢聆听，也请多多指教，谢谢。
谢谢罗馆长的演讲。我们现在进入答问时间。We will now open the floor for one question. Anyone?
我不清楚，刚才刘老师有没有说到，总共华冈的博物馆有多少陈之初先生捐献的作品呢？
我们印象当中，如果我没记错的话，至少有30件，包含他有没有？还有包含他陈之初先生的书法作品，恐怕就不止30件。对不起，因为我印象中是这样。
好，谢谢刘馆长。Thank you, Dr.
谢
Liu.
谢。
Due to time constraint, we are unable to deliver Sunny Tang's paper today. If anyone is interested, please leave your contact details with our registration desk, and we will share his paper with you with his approval. I would now like to invite Dr. Kwok Kian Woon, Professor of Sociology at the Nanyang Technological University and member of the Asian Civilisations Museum's Advisory Board, to deliver his closing remarks. Dr. Kwok, please.
Distinguished speakers, colleagues, participants, and friends. First of all, thanks to our organizers and our audience. I really admire your intellectual stamina. My thanks especially to the speakers for sharing your research. And in case I forget, I would like to also acknowledge the contribution of our translators today. Translators are heard and read, but are seldom seen. And without them, we cannot enter new worlds. And I will say something more about that later. So, for the moment, let's show our appreciation for their work today. The last time I stood here was in March last year, when I was making the closing remarks for Revisiting Raffles Symposium. So by now, I specialize in making closing remarks. But more importantly, I want to make the point that we should try to avoid thinking in silos, from exhibition to exhibition, and on each and every different occasion, not being able to connect with the various themes. Yeah. So I will also say something about that. In particular, in 2019, there was the bicentennial, which some people suffered some fatigue from, and the word bicentennial is hardly mentioned today. But it's worth asking whether in an entire year of marking, commemorating, and trying not to celebrate British colonialism, did we in fact achieve a critical assessment of the colonial past? Now, I would not revisit all that, but to say that in 2020, we must resolve to develop new directions and new perspectives, which I believe we have constantly been doing, including the Asian Civilisations Museum. But with this kind of discussion, this quality of research, this depth of exchange, can we widen and deepen both our scholarship and our curatorship? So I want to start off by referring to the discussion on the relationship between text and image, poetry and painting, and with the claim that the image or visual art is more difficult to interpret. Ken Chow used the analogy with, for example, a Nobel Prize-winning piece of literature, a novel, for example, which can be translated from a foreign language into the language that one is familiar with. I'm not sure about whether one is relatively easier or one is relatively more difficult. But under modern conditions today, and I will say a little more about this, what we have is this kind of special difficulty to make connections because of the brokenness of traditions and also because of the decline in our levels of cultural literacy. So, for example, my favorite reference to the continuities between Chinese poetry, painting, and dance is found in one particular theme, and the theme of the wild geese descending on the sandbank. And it's something which is found in poetry, is found in painting certainly, and also in dance. And it has lots of references to issues related to the role of intellectuals in relation to political power, for example. But without that kind of understanding, it would be very hard for us to make a deeper connection back with the tradition. So I think translation as a kind of metaphor for much of what we try to do in scholarship and curatorship is something that is worth exploring because of the need to enter into an unfamiliar territory using the background that we have, which has its own limitations, and at the same time developing something new in the process. So this happens with languages, it happens in the encounter between different traditions and different social worlds. And museums and their curators are especially poised for this special role, which is becoming even more important in a highly polarized but at the same time highly interconnected world. I think the current coronavirus situation is an example of how interconnected the world is today. So let me come to my second point. There seems to be great interest in the question of identity. It keeps coming up, and especially with reference to the art of the Chinese outside of China, meaning to say the Chinese overseas and so on. And the Chinese word for identity, 认同, to recognize similarity and commonality, makes us wonder, if we are looking for similarities and commonalities, what do we do about difference and differences? Especially, as I said, in a highly polarized world. So I think the whole question of identity has to be linked to the question of modernity. And modernity in terms of the new, the novel, and often associated with crisis. Right? And of course, there is this cliche to say that the Chinese word for crisis has these two components, which consists of danger as well as opportunity. But there is some truth to this idea of a crisis being a turning point, which can lead to things which were never quite known before or achieved before. It is not accidental that for today, the 1920s have been mentioned several times. Last year, there was another centenary marking 100 years, less well known in Singapore except in some circles, and that was the centenary of the May 4th movement of 1919. And again, in the discussions that were very rich, for those who were in some sense connected with that tradition, especially for the Chinese educated and the Hua Xiaosheng, of which many of the references in the opening keynote address by Yao Lao Shi, they would have more familiarity with, deeper immersion with, compared to those who were not schooled in that tradition. But I also observed that we might have also missed another opportunity in looking back at the 1920s last year, and maybe even from here onwards, which is that the 1920s and 30s worldwide and in Singapore was a time when we saw the growth of the publishing industry in terms of newspapers and magazines and so on. This is clearly the backdrop behind Yao Lao Shi's very, very comprehensive and exciting presentation of the introduction of political cartoons into the popular landscape and imagination. And what we may not quite realize in Singapore was that there were these parallel histories of the growth of modern consciousness among our other communities. The Malays with Kampong Glam as a publishing hub, the Tamils with a new social political movement and so on. I won't go into that today except to note this point, that the question of identity and the question of politics, along with changes in the technology and in mass communications, all come together in ways which we need to have a better understanding. Now I come to the question of the relationship between identity and politics. I think it was quite interesting to me that when Yao Lao Shi opened up to say that I'm dealing with art and the history of art, and for politics it's really complicated and that it would take more than an hour. But actually, if you look through all the slides, there was a lot of politics in it. You cannot avoid, it's like the air that we breathe from the late 19th century to the 1950s, which he spoke of. And this is why the reflections on colonialism last year and the reflections on art history in Singapore this year and going forward, we must widen and deepen the discussion. Because the images that you saw by the 1950s, the changed consciousness of what you might call localization and maybe a kind of early stage of nationalism and so on, these were very, very potent social and intellectual forces, which went beyond the gestures of references to that earlier, all these many small developments in referring to the local landscape, the coconut. And there's this wonderful picture of in the exhibition, this painting by Huang Baofang in 1966, Three Friends of Nanyang, mangosteen, durian, and rambutan. You cannot be more local than that. 1966, that kind of consciousness. And this is a kind of question that we have to ask beyond, at a superficial level. In what sense has that consciousness really developed even further from 1965? So, if I may move on, I spoke about identity and politics. I'd like to say something about art and politics. And my favorite reference to this, which I've used on other occasions, is to say that artists, and this is a point which was raised by George Orwell when he discussed Charles Dickens and his work. Every writer, he says, has a message, right? And the minutest details of the writer's work are influenced by the message. So this is the famous quotation. All art is propaganda. On the other hand, not all propaganda is art. So when we think about the kind of political cartoons that Yao Lao Shi introduced to us, they're truly fascinating. And the woodcuts, they are aesthetically powerful. And yet, in some ways, they were maybe not propaganda per se, but a kind of counter-propaganda. They had a political message. So, I think that one of our challenges is how do we discuss the relationship between art and politics, and at the same time preserve or recognize a sense of the relative autonomy of art away from politics. I have more to say about this, but I won't have time. You only have to think about Lu Xun's famous essay that art and politics must soon diverge, right? Because the identification of any art with any regime has grave implications, especially for artistic autonomy. I have one last point, and that has got to do with the question of the universality of art. Is that something that is real or imagined or aspirational, and is something that we can look forward to? In what sense can people from very different cultural backgrounds come together to appreciate each other's traditions? So, my two references are, number one, Cai Yanpei's belief in the importance of aesthetic education and in the universality of art, 艺术的普遍性. And this strong belief to the point where he says that aesthetic education can replace religion. Right? Now, that may not be wholly true, but you can see the importance that he has placed on aesthetic education, which is the work of museums. My last example, really, one thing that is missing from our discussion, perhaps maybe because we have been focusing not only on Singapore, but Nanyang, Southeast Asia, is that there was a historical moment, especially in the late 1930s, where there was an evolving, well, early 30s onwards, or maybe even late 20s onwards, along with these waves of modernity and modernism, there was a historical moment where there was an imagination of Asia and the commonalities between Asian countries. And the best example I can think of is Santiniketan in Kolkata, where Tagore in 1939 invited Shi Beihong to spend some months there. Can we imagine that India and China, both civilizations having such great internal heterogeneity in the first place? How is it possible for these two cultural forces to even understand each other? And yet, we have something like Santiniketan. So, in an article in which Shi Beihong's daughter, Shi Fangfang, recalls the time she herself visited the place, it was very interesting, and this comes back to the point about text and image. Because Shi Beihong produced some of his most fantastic works in India, including Yi Gong Yi Shan, the foolish old man who removed the mountain, which later Mao Zedong made very famous, yeah, for different purpose. Yeah. Now, I just want to give an example, and then I promise to end soon, yeah, which is that we've spoken about Ren Po Nian and the figures, human figures. Now, in Shi Bei Hong's animal paintings, according to the daughter, he too expressed deeper meanings. So there is a painting on the horse, which had inscriptions and seals, of which, when Shi Bei Hong's daughter visited Santiniketan, in being shown this painting, she shared with her host the inscription. As it turns out, this painting was painted at a time when Tagore was recovering from illness. And the inscription was, November 1940. Bei Hong painted this to congratulate Elder Tagore on his recovery from his illness. Gentle breeze and beautiful sun, the celestial and human worlds were celebrating. How's that for the universality of art? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kwok, for your closing remarks. Our sincere thank you to our speakers and moderators and all of you in the audience for your participation and enthusiasm. Please do not forget to fill in the feedback forms on your way out. The museum is open till 7 p.m. today, so do visit our special exhibition, Living with Ink, if you haven't done so. Admission tickets can be collected at our registration desk. Thank you all once again for attending our Living with Ink Symposium, and we wish you a happy Yuan Xiao Festival. 祝大家元宵节快乐!